Good morning. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm grateful for it. Ultimately what I'd say is I like to think of it as both an opportunity for me to be able to communicate what God is sharing personally with me and see what that means because I don't believe we should ever open the Word and it return void, right? The Word of God is speaking it into our lives in all places and at all times. Well, the message point that I have for this morning is found in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. So if you have a Bible or my home church, he says, device by which you'd like to follow along, feel free to do so. Please open up the Word to that. And let's read it together, start to finish. Begin with. So this is the word of God in the first part of the verse of chapter 1 of Joshua. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your feet will tread upon I have given to you, just as I have promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law that shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. My wife suggested that I start off this message by playing Get On Your Feet. I don't know if you guys know that song. It's an old one by Gloria Stefan. But I'll skip that and I'll ask you to remain seated. But I wanted to set the tone of the message by having us ask ourselves some questions to help measure our readiness. The title of this message is Readiness for Action. Have you ever felt unprepared for what is in front of you? The leading stats on anxiety and worry have only grown. Around us, we find more and more that this feeling and concern has overtaken us and others. What about you? What are some challenges that you face personally in your life that well up these emotions inside of you? How do you cope with them? Now, clearly, Joshua was a leader, but what is a leader? Not everyone feels called to be able to lead. In fact, most of us, myself included, can have the tendency to feel that it's a gifting that some have but others don't. But I'm here to tell you that as someone who's always struggled with a sense of confidence, that it's a much simpler concept than we set it out to be. I've heard leadership summed up and described in just one simple, basic word: influence. Leadership is influence. It is as simple and as important as that. So think about it. What are some specific examples maybe in your own life that you have influence? What are some relationships? I can name some for myself: as a father, as a parent, as a husband, as a manager. And up to this year, I was an elder in my church that my wife and I attend. Well, those each come with their own specific group of individuals, their own specific calling in our lives around which we're to take up the responsibility to think about what it is to do, to leave a mark, to be responsible for making an impression, to stand up and say, what are the things that I'm trying to influence, and how is it that I'm doing so? Well, that can actually point back to that earlier question that maybe all this responsibility has a way of overwhelming you. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you woke up one day and feel like suddenly you're realizing that all this seems to have happened without your full awareness. Maybe you're seeing the importance and urgency of it. When did I get so old? And how in the world did I get so much responsibility? Maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you're waiting on that moment, on that promise of change that hasn't happened yet. You're feeling willing to take on more, but you haven't been given the opportunity. I remember that being in my 20s and having this feeling of wanting to be able to do more, but not knowing what to do. So what can we do about it? And more importantly, what does God tell us to do? Well, as we look at this life of Joshua, we see him at a great moment of challenge and change. This is a really pinnacle transition point, right? From the life of Moses and the transition through the wilderness and everything that he had been leading the nation of Israel. So now he's transitioned all of that, and God is trusting Joshua now to be the one to take up that mantle and lead from here on. And I think in this conversation that God has with Joshua, we can have some specific things that we see about God that are applicable to our lives. And so I want to do that in really three simple, basic ways. I want to talk about them as we break this passage up into the 3 bullet points that I have. We can know God's plan, we can know his preparation, and ultimately we can know his promises for us and his calling to be ready to take up on our lives. So let's look at this passage in these 3 parts. And so if you look again at the verses in the first ones, the verses 1 through 4, we can see God's plan, right? We can clearly see that what God is laying out here for Joshua is a clear picture of what he had commanded him to do. He is to go in, he is to take the land, right? He's commanded him that, Joshua, this is your time. This is your moment to do exactly what I've asked and had prepared ahead of time for you to do. No good leader can be effective without a plan. There was a plan. If you didn't see it, take a look at it again here. This is the land that I have given, and this is your task, Joshua. It is now your time and moment to be my servant and take up the mantle from Moses. Being a leader means having a plan. As a local church, we have a plan too, right? It's called the Great Commission. You can't be effective as a local church without it. It provides focus. It provides strategy. And it actually gives us a sense of comfort and assurance for what we're called to do, right? I mean, without a plan, without action, without an idea around what you're gathering yourself, it's really hard to take clear action. And I would challenge that planning itself is very biblical, right? God is a planner. This is clear in the same sense that the Bible itself, throughout its pages, has continued to reveal all of God's plan to us. From the time Adam fell until the death and resurrection of Jesus on the cross, God has been working out a specific plan of redemption. And this plan is acted today because God's word reveals that he has future plans that he has for what's to come. Joshua's was clear. I mean, you can read here, like God is saying to him, this is all the stuff that I have for you to do. He had opportunity to understudy under Moses for over 40 years. So if you look back at Joshua's life, this is a really interesting kind of point of this topic, because as I was thinking about what it meant to Joshua to have this calling to go in and take the land, right? This isn't the first time he's had this thought, right? If you remember, 40 years earlier, he was one of the 2 spies that were willing to do so at that point in time. He and Caleb were the only ones to come back and say, we can do this. We're able to take this land. Well, he had to wait 40 years, right? So if you want to check that again, if you were to follow along with me, go back to Numbers chapter 14, verses 26 through 38. I'm just going to read a few little pieces of it in verses 26, 33, and 38. First it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, How long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I have heard their grumbling of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. And if you switch up to verse 33, it says, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lays in the wilderness. And verse 38 says, of those men who went to spy out the land, only Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh remained alive. Right? So Joshua had to wait. He had to prepare himself. He had to, knowing the full plan of God, be willing to stand and have patience for what God was doing in the midst of this, in spite of what he wanted and he believed God could do. Not one other soul from that entire generation would inherit the land. There were many days and many circumstances that must have come and gone during that wandering and waiting, that Joshua must have wondered, what in the world is God doing? I don't know about you, but patience is not something that I often handle well. And in a culture that feeds itself on instant gratification, having an idea of what is ahead and having to wait for it is not easy. My wife and I are going through the process of building a home. And so since January of this year, we've been in this kind of phase of transition, right? So you find a builder, you kind of have to sign your life away to them, and so to speak, to give yourself this big process and plan. And hopefully soon, we're kind of on the end of it here. Within the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we're hoping to hear that home's finally done. We're ready to be through this all. And when you're in the midst of that, as we are now, you can often wonder yourself, was this really worth it? Was this really worth it? I mean, the old home had its warts, it had its living challenges, but it wasn't so bad. Thinking about what we've kind of had to walk through, it's meant selling our house and moving everything into storage. I don't know about you, maybe you've moved, maybe you can sympathize with this, but relocating ourselves to live temporarily with Grandma and Grandpa, longer commutes to work and church. Yeah. So patience is hard. Patience is something that I don't think we handle well. But I think planning means knowing that you have this in front of you and you can handle that, right? Planning means knowing there are costs to what you're doing. Planning means knowing you've counted those circumstances that are to come, but you're willing to take that on. It gives you assurance in the midst of what you're dealing with. It means having a right perspective on what's to come. It settles your nerves as you learn to depend and trust in God. It provides a clear understanding for the how, and it equips us with goals and milestones as we walk into what we face. So now if I move to the second portion here, it's the preparation itself. And that's found in verse 5, where it says again, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Transitions don't always happen gracefully. Wouldn't it have been nice for Joshua if Moses had stuck around? He just stepped back and said, here, I'll let you lead, but I'll be here if you need advice. I'll be here if you need any consolation or consulting about these things. But that's not what happened, right? I mean, Moses dies. He's gone. Now it's really on Joshua to take up this responsibility. Change is hard. Change is one of the most difficult parts of growth. It feels uncertain, and that allows one thing to creep back in and break apart anything in life. And that word is a really important one. That's fear. It's destructive. It casts a long, dark cloud over anything we are called to do. Think about it. Joshua had a front row seat to the work of God through his servant Moses. I mean, some of the astounding miracles and ways in which God led the people of Israel would have been so visible and so recognizable to the power and capability that God had. And yet you think about all the times that the nation of Israel rebelled and they failed to listen. They wanted something different. They were a very needy bunch, right? I mean, I think about that because I have an 8.5-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. And sometimes it's like you give them everything, and yet they still have a hard time trusting in you and being willing to depend on you. And sometimes I feel like the more that you are visible to them and the more you don't give them the opportunity to do things for themselves, the more dependence they drive, and the more greedy, the more selfish, the more arrogant, the more proud that we can become. I think that's a real true depiction of the nation of Israel in the sense that God doesn't have that sort of visible interaction oftentimes with us if we're unattentive to the way he's working in our lives. But at the same point in time, it draws a self-reliance on him from us that should be there. It shouldn't be so, why aren't you doing it this way? Why aren't you acting the way I expect you to, God? So think about it again. And just, what is it that God has done with Joshua as he's prepared him for this time? How has Joshua been able to listen and learn and grow from the things he's seen and the way that God has moved in the past? And yet what's so fascinating about it is he still makes it a point, God does, to tell Joshua at least 3, if not almost 4 times in here, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous, for I am with you. To remind him of this and give him confidence as he prepares to ask the nation to now listen and follow him. These are no small shoes, and this is no small task. It's only realistic to expect Joshua, as faithful he has been, to need reminding of God's plan and his preparation. The future is not clear to us. It never is. And for that reason, we tend to look at it with a certain amount of skepticism, with our own excuses for trying to pass on action and stay out of the game. Do you question your qualifications in the circumstances that you find yourself? Maybe as a father, maybe as a spouse, or as a parent, maybe in your role in work. I think if we were all even the slightest bit honest with ourselves, we would say we have our doubts. It can be much simpler to find all the reasons why we are not the right person for the job. I mean, think about the interaction that God had with Moses, and it's very similar, the story, right, where the burning bush, to what we're seeing here in Joshua. And remember all those excuses that Moses made about not being eloquent, not having good speech. And yet at the end of it, God says, if you were to flip back to Exodus, it's actually found in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. It says, but Moses has said to the Lord, O Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be your mouth, and I will teach you what you shall speak. Such a fascinating a parallel there. Moses, why do you question me? I know from personal experience that God has proven his faithfulness time and time again. That as he has led me in the past, as I have seen his goodness, his faithfulness to me in each new challenge, I can have confidence in the future in front of me. But it's that uncertainty, right? It's that little bit of uncertainty that causes fear paralysis in us. It causes us to hesitate. And that doubt can then grow. I think what it means is we all need to be reminded daily, and sometimes moment by moment, of God's assurances, that he has been preparing us for what is before you and I. We have to remember those truths. This year I felt called to leave my former job, to pursue one that's brought on more responsibility. So I work in the IT world. I'm a full-time. I now have moved into a position as an IT manager of a local company. We make bean bags. So I don't know if anyone knows bean bags, but of all things, it's a fun time. I enjoy it. And prior to that, I was working for this company that did med device, and we had facilities in Mexico. I was working long trips. I was making huge projects, implementations, moving them to new application systems. And it meant a lot of time on the road. It meant a lot of stress. It meant sacrifice on the part of my wife and my family to be away from Dad. But in spite of all those reasons, to look at it and say, this is such a clear, cut and dry decision as to why I should do something different, I still struggled with the choice. And I think that's because it can feel better sometimes to stick with the stresses you know, to be a little comfortable with the pain and the panic that you have, because it's something that you understand, you're used to, versus the unknown, the uncertainty of something different. And I think it can sometimes feel better to handle it that way, to pause and to question in fear what that changes might mean. But let me encourage you that something special happens when you do, really. Change is also a catalyst for your dependence on God. That's what led me to this passage, to be honest. As I'm thinking about this transition, about what it meant, what do you do in those circumstances? Where do you draw strength? Where do you draw wisdom and knowledge and try to gain understanding for what God is and who He is and how He behaves and how we can learn from that? And I searched out His Word, and I found somebody who was in this same state of transition, the same state of taking on something new and on that verge. And it points you back to wisdom, right? It points you back to a place where you're looking again for God to be the one to draw strength from. So, preparation is a huge part of it. It's a huge stake in understanding how we feel the capability and the readiness for what God has for us. But ultimately, there's one final thing that I think we need to depend on and need to remember, and that is the promises of God. That's the promises that He makes in His Word. And that's found in verses 6 through 9 of Joshua chapter 1 here. After understanding the preparation that has been part of Joshua's life, God concludes with some amazing promises. God lays out such profound promises to His servant, who is about to perform one of the most difficult military campaigns that has ever been attempted. Joshua was leading an entire nation of people into a foreign land. And he was responsible for them, right? Do you ever need constant reminders of the truth of who God is? I know I do. His Word is clear in regards to what He says about Himself. There's such a release in knowing that you are not alone, that God can be trusted. If you flip with me, I got another parallel to this. It's found in Isaiah 41, verses 8 through 10, where it says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you, and I have not cast you off. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Just listen to how similar those words are to what you find in Joshua here, and about who God is and what He does. God was also promising Joshua that he can be trusted as faithful. He is commanding Joshua to be diligent and for Joshua to remind himself of all the laws in the Scripture laid out. But he was doing so knowing that people will stumble. That not only the people, but that Joshua would struggle to follow after him. And so God tells Joshua, this is what you should do, Joshua. You need to be careful to follow everything that you've been told. You need to be constantly reminding yourself of it, lest you forget what's been commanded. What I have commanded is laying the blueprint for everything I'm asking you to do. But I want you to notice one thing, and I found this really unique as I looked at it a couple of times. The presence and strength of the Lord is not conditional here. His presence is not conditional. It's a representation of the love of God. It's not far removed even when we think it is. Even when we are not diligent to meditate on His Word, He remains ready and willing for us to come back to Him. You see, God is not a far-off deity, uninterested in our problems. Grace is something we think we only attribute to the New Testament, but God is always the same. We are so quick to forget. Even if you have a plan, everything is not going to form out and turn out exactly as you plan it to. Expect it to. Clearly, if you've ever read the rest of the book of Joshua, you will see this, right? There's many circumstances that are ahead in the road, whether that be Achan and the sin of the Battle of Ai, where he hid some of the treasure, hid some of what was won, to the deception of the Gibeonites, who deceive Israel and were allowed to remain in the land, ultimately caused pagan worship and practices to drift back in. There will be trials and difficulty along the way. And when you face those moments, what will you do? That reminds me so much of God's ability to work out his plan in spite of the brokenness of this world, without pretending to articulate or fully comprehend how it's possible that he can work all things for his good in spite of the terrible things that we've experienced. We can all see this as truth. And so we should learn to trust his will, submit to his word, and listen to its instructions. So for me, it all comes down to faith. I mean, if I were to kind of summarize this story and look at God's communication with Joshua, and now it's a moment where Joshua gets to respond. And how is he going to respond? Well, that's acting out in faith, right? You can have all the planning. You can have all the preparation. You can know the promises of the truth of God in your life, but in the end, it's about turning that into action. The story is about a moment where God comes to someone ready to do an amazing thing and sees them right where they are. He speaks words of encouragement. He speaks words of promise and great challenge and said, this is what I am telling you to go, and this is what I'm telling you to do. Joshua, like many others we see in the Bible, are broken people who believed and trusted in God. You can have read the lives of Ruth or David, Nehemiah, Daniel, and see similarity in each of their lives. They had faith not in themselves, but in God and his ability. If we place our trust in anything else, we are settling for something of a lesser strength. And if we aren't listening when he calls on us, that doesn't stop what he is doing, but it means we get to miss out on being used, and even more importantly, an opportunity for learning and discipleship. So now's that chance where I can ask, what is God asking you to do? Where is he speaking into your life right now about what plans and preparation you've been granted? I think we want that to mean some major life-altering decision. You know, it's usually in those critical moments where we're trying to decide some important big circumstance, like our education or our career or our marriage or parenting or something real pivotal. But I don't think that's true. I really don't. I believe that the Bible tells us that we are to cultivate a simpler and more purposeful discipline. I think that's the importance of this. We won't just walk up to those big moments that come ahead of us and come at us and suddenly decide, now is the time for me to get things right. See, I think faith is measured. I do. I think James lays that out clearly when he talks about showing faith by what we do, right? And it's in that experiential practice and discipline in our lives that we begin to understand the power and majesty and awe of who God is. It means it's a skill that we have to practice and hone and tweak and craft. It means it comes down to each of us stretching and growing it. And if you're like me, it probably feels completely unnatural. Couldn't be more opposite of what you probably have a tendency to want to do. Maybe put it this way. Maybe you're on your way home today. Maybe you're in your home and you have that chance to speak up about Jesus. Maybe you have that chance to turn things to a spiritual conversation. Maybe to say a word of encouragement where you haven't in the past, or at work the same. Maybe it means pulling your spouse aside and praying together for the first time in a while. It's that boldness, it's that act of faith, right? It shows us the simple ways that Jesus is someone that we depend on. So let me just close by asking that, in this sense, are you prepared for action? How would you rank yourself when it comes to your readiness? Are you able to respond when God calls on you to take a step? And I hope that out of this passage here, out of this story of Joshua, you've gained some encouragement when it comes to having assurance that you will and you can. Because that is what this passage is all about. It's not about putting somebody out of our league, about comparisons. This is about who our Father is. And as crazy as it might seem, He indeed does want to use people like us to accomplish His will. I'm going to close here. So let's pray.